Hi, good evening. As the slide says, I head up software development at the FT. It's a pretty diverse title because of the multitude of technologies we do have at the Financial Times. Pretty much most of the languages that you're familiar with are there, Java being the main one. So what's on the menu? What I'm hoping to do is, before I actually speak about Agile at the FT, is actually to provide you a quick snapshot of the landscape that we're dealing in. The kind of challenges both from a business perspective and a technology perspective as well. And on the back of that, the kind of decisions we make. And finally, I've got a couple of examples from some of our projects that we're running, one being the advertising program, and This is Africa, and some challenges that we're facing with those projects. So as we kick off, incidentally, the slides will be available as a slide pack. So yeah, apologies if the people at the back can't really read the slides correctly. A note I have to make is I've actually gone through a very old text written in the 3rd century BC by a chap called Chankaya. This guy was known as the kingmaker. He effectively created the Chandragupta Maurya dynasty, which is one of the biggest in India at the time. And a lot of his quotes are very applicable to how we see software development today. What he tried to do is build a kingdom. What we try and do is basically pretty much the same in organizations. The collaboration between different people, the way you work with allies, etc., etc. So throughout the entire slide pack, I've kind of added quotes at the top. So yeah, so we kick off now. Financial Times. Key areas that we're looking for is basically when we're looking at technologies, products, services that we need to deliver, we're looking for them to be global. Effectively, the FT brand is global. This includes all our other titles as well, The Banker, Investors Chronicle, This is Africa, The Confidentials, etc. So ultimately, we are global. We also need to be adaptable because we're dealing in an environment which is very, very fluid, both consumer-facing all the way back to the business. So whatever we deliver needs to be adaptable. Again, it's evolving. The way the consumer adapts, the way we adapt to the consumer, the way editorial write their articles, just the nature of our readership, etc., etc. And it needs to be measurable because ultimately there needs to be a return on investment. We need to measure the metrics. How profitable are we? How beneficial is the technology that we're delivering? What are the problems with it? And it needs to be supported because ultimately whatever we deliver in technology needs to be supported in life. And the last one is basically being in line with consumer trends. Ideally, you want to be ahead of the consumer trends so you can predict what's happening in the future. So that's kind of the landscape from an FT organizational point of view. The landscape. In a nutshell, I've put some points here. I'm not going to run through all of them, but ultimately what we're looking for is timeframes are getting narrower and narrower. Time to delivery, more and more pressure on it. Everything is faster, analytics are faster, the way we change is faster, the way we need to adapt is faster, windows of opportunities are less and less. When you've got social media, you're talking about literally seconds when you're dealing with breaking news on Twitter, for example. The way we consume technology is changing very quickly as well. Our audience is becoming more technology savvy as well. Most often, they actually dictate the way we need to deliver our technology and our services. In the case of the FT, we actually have a global workforce. We have offices in Manila, New York, so we need to cater for that as well, and that's changing again. Policies, regulations, government policies, etc., all need to be catered for. A big key one for us is also governance, compliance, certification, and standards, PCI, ISO, etc. These present their own challenges because every country is different. A good example which I came across a few weeks ago was Pearson produces educational books. In China, there's a big question around whether Tibet actually is a country or not. So there's issues there. You wouldn't expect it, but again, within the FT, because we deliver global content, we need to be savvy about how different governments see our content as well. And it also impacts advertising as an example, because every country has a different legislation on advertising and return on investment there. So that's kind of the landscape we're dealing in. What's the key? The main thing is keeping everything visible. We need to keep communicating. Communicating at different levels. One is within teams, amongst individuals. Another one is measuring the progress and status, so everyone's aware of where you are at any point in time, be it the business, be it technology, be it another service such as security, for example. The process and methodologies need to be in line as well. They all need to be singing from the same hymn sheet. Within the software itself, everyone needs to understand the capabilities of the software that you're dealing in. Utilizing engineering principles, so this is from architecture all the way from testing and ultimately development. And this has to be cross-discipline. So it's one thing technology knowing what they're doing, but it's another thing when editorial aren't aware of what technology is actually capable of or what the limitations are. So ultimately what we're trying to do is keeping everything visible. That's the biggest challenge we have. Okay, a note on Agile. As John kind of alluded to, within the FT, the aim is to see Agile as a verb, not a noun. And it needs to disseminate itself as a lifestyle. So it's, again, back to my point, technology might be as agile as it wants, but if the business is not agile, they're still expecting something going in a conveyor belt one way and coming out the other end as they wanted it. And no matter how much they put on the conveyor belt, they're still on the same speed of delivery. So sometimes there needs to be a negotiation. This entire lifespan needs to be brought into light, especially when you're dealing with heads of departments, et cetera, and key decision makers. Part of that is also defining and measuring what we're actually capable of. And this is a message that needs to be communicated to your end client, be the editorial in our case, be it another client if you're a digital agency. And again, determining what your actual realized benefits are, whether it's a direct monetary benefit in the case of the advertising program, or a realized benefit when you're actually improving editorial workflow, for example. And the other thing is we need to keep on evolving. You can't say, yes, we've done Agile or we're doing Agile and that's it. It's continuously evolving. There's a paper produced by Gartner, and what they see is an issue for governance. This is kind of echoed within the FT because a lot of the standard frameworks for governance, for example, architecture, vendor management, software processes, as you'll find later on, there's a lot of dependencies in these areas, which means although you might have the ideal Agile scenario in your teams, because of the dependencies on other departments, governance, in any shape or form, you're going to struggle. Okay, so what do we do? In the case of the FT, so the idea is that we find champions. Within every team, we find people who are actually advocates of Agile, who appreciate what needs to be done. Empowering the teams, both from a self-management and self-organizational point of view. So you literally have no fat. Everything's trim and lean, and everyone is empowered to make a decision. Managing dependencies, depending on the nature of the program, these are either managed very well or very poorly. When they're not managed very poorly, it's usually because of the number of dependencies you have, and also the nature. Cross-skilling and training is key because ultimately you want people to experience different parts of the FT, especially when you go down to a technology level. We utilize, for example, Heroku, Salesforce, and I think, yeah, we've got Amazon as well. But at the same time, we have a traditional enterprises, so we use virtualized machines, etc. So there's a move from kind of traditional languages like Java all the way to kind of Apex, and you're dealing with the kind of more rapid development languages. But again, cross-skilling means that they appreciate how different teams are handling Agile and how different teams are basically meeting the challenge of the business of being adaptable to it. Also keeping the team structure simple. The more complicated it gets, the more admin, the more overhead. The iteration cycles are short, so the stories are well defined and they're delivered, and also the business knows what they're getting every time. So they don't have to literally twiddle their thumbs. In some cases, we actually have dependencies on the third parties, which means sometimes we can't always have these short iteration cycles. Again, a key point, communication and collaboration. The FD made a big move to Google Apps and Google+, so that's actually helped us there. We use Skype very heavily because of our globally distributed teams. But again, it's basically coming to a working model on how we collaborate. Enabling adaptability and rapid change, feedback mechanisms. This goes all the way from typical development cycles all the way to, for example, when we're dealing with the TDA, when we do the change advisory boards, when we have the release advisory boards. At every level, the aim is to have a rapid change and feedback. And also, lastly, is having the right tools. And this goes across the board, all the way from managing your project lifecycle, all the way down to actually your technology stack, and making these available as well. A key question here, when it comes to the world of Agile, or the world of delivery, is what is done? Done actually varies in the FT depending on the project you're dealing in, so there's no one defined way of considering it done. Part of the things we need to consider, the lifestyle, the code, the way the unit tests are done. And a key thing we also have is demos and retrospectives. Retrospectives are actually key, and we're finding them more and more useful. It's a lessons learned. Not all programs are doing them, but the uptake has proven positive, and more programs are looking at each other and saying, okay, they're doing retrospectives, they actually learned quite a bit, so why don't we do it? And again, back to the earlier point, which is teams are self-empowered, so they just adopt retrospective methodologies. And documentation. In some cases, we actually do need documentation because there needs to be a handover done to operations. Can't underestimate the value of documentation, especially if you're on the coalface when something goes down on the websites or a system goes down and you get a phone call. You need to know what to do. And ultimately, panic guides, support guides, etc. Part of the onus on development is to actually create good documentation for the people who are actually going to handle this in live. Okay, part of the development cycle is that we actually end up with technical debt. You can't get away from it. That's the reality. But what we can do is actually determine the quantity and minimize its impact. And the aim is to address it at some point in time. The way we minimize it at the FT, using good design patterns, coding standards, using tools to help us make sure that we have good coding standards. Peer review is key. TDD, BDD, these kind of methodologies help to this. Refactoring code. This is not always possible because of the limitations on delivery times, but where possible, we do enforce this if we can. And again, automating as much as we can. Okay, what do we have to play with? So ultimately, when you're making decisions, you also need to understand the technologies that you're dealing in. Are they supportable? Can we use them? Do we have the resources? Do we have the manpower? Do we have the appreciation? These are some of the key trends that we're kind of seeing in the industry. But the idea is ultimately to understand what you've got in the buffet. The right hardware, the right platforms, the right software. In some cases, we've actually gone down Heroku as an example. Rapid delivery, we can get something out there, and we live with the risk. So part of choosing the right technology is actually to understand that the business needs to sign off on that risk. Not every platform is infallible. So that's a key thing. Any system that you choose, at some point will go down. It's how you cater for when it goes down. That's the key. Salesforce, another example. Amazon. Everyone knows Amazon went down a few times last year. It's how you cater for that failure. How you design for Amazon. How you design for a platform which sits in the cloud is different to how you design for a system that's actually in-house and on VMs, for example. So the idea is to understand the engineering principles that go behind these architecture decisions as well. The fact that everything needs to be scalable, accuracy. As things get bigger, accuracy ultimately diminishes. So this also needs to be appreciated by the business. So part of technology's job is to actually communicate these ideas, and they understand these principles as well. So when they say, well, we want X, we say, okay, we can deliver X, but these are the caveats. It's having those kind of conversations. In our case, JavaScript is pretty key with the FT app that we have, which is pure HTML5. It's an expanding universe, and it's appreciating that it's getting bigger. Code is less tangible. So what I mean by that is the fact that nowadays a lot of coding is actually done by building on existing frameworks. All you're doing is augmenting that framework. You're not actually writing code in a traditional sense. And it's appreciating that if you utilize frameworks that exist out there, you can actually get your time to delivery shortened. The walled garden of Eden. So this is basically assuming that you're living in a walled garden when reality is you're not. There's big dependencies out there. So although you go to Heroku, for example, you're limited by its capability when you're actually delivering global content. It might not be the best in APAC, for example, so you have to put a CDN in front of it as an example. So don't always consider that your technology choice will tick all the boxes. There's limitations to every technology that we have, but it's basically coming up with hybrid solutions to overcome those. Okay, an example that I have. This is the advertising program. I actually have some of my colleagues here from that program. So any questions? So this is a very quick snapshot and an example of how Agile as a lifestyle is working. The ultimate aim is to actually deliver cash, advertising, improve it, time to market, increase the amount of capabilities that you have, contextual advertising, that world. That's kind of the ultimate objective. The lifespan estimated end of this year. Team size pretty small, considering what we're actually delivering. In this case, the pragmatic decision has been made to utilize a mixture of Scrum and Kanban. That pragmatism actually goes to the fact that Scrum allows you for that review. You can actually review it regularly, and also it reports back to the business. So you're ticking that box there because that's what the business in this case actually wants. Kanban, because ultimately the team prefer to work that way for delivering this particular piece of work. So there's no hard and fast rule on how you actually employ Agile methodologies. The idea is to be pragmatic and understand what the business actually want, and tune your Agile methodologies accordingly. Okay, sorry, another point here is that what is done here is actually in review at the moment, so that's a key point. Some of the challenges, one of the key ones here, which is kind of dependency on third parties. Because of the nature of the project, how diverse it is, and because we're depending on these third parties to deliver what they need to do, there's hindrance on the project. Third parties could be internal. Other teams need to deliver a particular piece of functionality before the advertising team can. Or it might be external, where other third parties who are actually delivering adverts, for example, need to make sure that they've delivered what their piece of functionality is before we can, or understand the dependencies between the two. This is also boils down to actually the dependencies you have between them as well. Sometimes you might not always be aware of the dependencies until you actually put something in live or until it's in test. Then you realize, oh, we've spotted something. But ultimately, this is the key challenge on this program is just dealing with the number of third parties you have. And again, a good thing here is that they've adopted retrospectives once a month, and this is a key learning piece as well for the program. And this can also be fed back to the business as well. And in this case, the team was using Skype, and they moved to Google+. So apparently it's a very positive feedback on Google. So, okay, I have to note here, which is one of my notes, the fourth one, which is around Antil Pro and Rally. Antil Pro is basically, the reason for it being a bit of an issue is because at the FT we've actually customized it over and above its kind of comfort zone. The nature of the FT customization means every time you need to do a change, you have to kind of peel apart all these customizations just to get everything in there. So that's kind of why it's a limitation, not the actual software itself, but what we've done with it. Okay, another example. This is basically a database on Africa and emerging markets and how you make that transparent so people can actually feed off this intellectual property effectively. Lifespan, the first estimated phase is 6 months. Team size, slightly bigger. And this is what we consider Scrum hybrid. This is effectively because, again, dependencies on third parties here, is because in order to compile this database, we need multiple feeds from multiple sources. And until those feeds are in place and until we've got that database established, only then can you actually work on it. And that's one of the key problems here. So that hence this kind of Scrum hybrid term that we're using. The reporting cycle is monthly, so this is basically reporting back to the business, but the iteration cycle is actually 2 weeks. This is just to allow everyone to estimate the stories and epics quicker, and also the business is aware of what we're delivering. The challenge in this case is because of the nature of the project and because of the team sizes, the BAs and the product owners, sometimes their boundaries get blurred. And ultimately it impacts the developers because they don't know who they should be talking to and whose remit it actually is. But that's more a business process as opposed to a technology piece. And in this case, we've actually got third party, we've actually got developers based in Ukraine, which kind of presents its own challenges, time zones, the fact that their broadband connections aren't as good as ours. They drop out of Skype calls, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a bit difficult, but there's workarounds. And a final point around just an example about when you end up depending on internal third parties, where you actually, in our case, trying to open up ports in firewalls, we have to go through endless hoops just to get this done. Turnaround is, I think, 10 man days. So in conclusion, ultimately, you've got key areas that you need to work on. Communication and collaboration, what we're finding is basically the key area that we need to work on. And this is both internally and externally. So this is within technology, but also when we're dealing with other business units. Empowering and self-organization, very much when you have teams that need to go to somebody else to get a decision, slow down. The admin and the bureaucracy increases. So if you can keep everything within that team, empower them, keep a flat structure, things get done faster. Making sure you've got the technology choices are made up front and everyone understands the limitations of the technologies. Employing sound architecture, development, testing principles throughout and adhering to them as well. Resources and training, John alludes to, he's aware of the kind of challenges we have at the FT. We always look for people who are kind of, I would say, super mature in the role. It's because even our senior developers ultimately have to play a role sometimes as an architect facing the business. It's just the nature of the world within the FT. So it's trying to get the right resources. It's a big challenge. Establishing teams and communities so everyone becomes proud of what they're actually delivering. There's no point actually delivering something if you're not proud of it. I got told a long time ago, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. Otherwise, don't bother. Analytics and metrics. So this is basically allowing us internally within technology to feed on what we're building and improve it, but at the same time for the business to understand what we're delivering as well. And it's a two-way process. And finally, processes, policies, frameworks, and standards. There is a ring fence we have to work within. And it's making sure that ring fence doesn't hinder what we deliver, but at the same time is flexible enough to actually get out what we need. And that's it. Thank you.
I had a question for the first speaker, for Jagdeep from the FT, if that's okay. So, really great to hear you talking about measurability and that. Could you just talk us through the metrics you use when you're measuring the effectiveness of software delivery?
Okay, yeah. So it depends on the program that you're dealing in, because ultimately you also have to determine the technology that you're using as well. A good example is basically the number of bug fixes. So as you monitor them, the idea is that they become less and less. So that's basically saying, okay, something somewhere is working. And then the idea is to tie that up with the changes in process. When we increase automated tests, the number of automated tests that need to be done, again, it's a metric. So shortening the amount of stories and then comparing those stories with what's actually being released and the quality, what actually comes back into test, etc. That's another way. So the metrics are basically, again, like I said earlier, it's depending on the kind of what you're actually trying to deliver. But ultimately what we're trying to do is every metric is not a way to, one thing I have to mention is the metrics are not used as a way to beat the teams over their heads. Because a lot of the times the big danger is when you start generating metrics, it's used as a way to basically have a go at the team to say, okay, we need to do this, we need to do this, and eventually the team gets under pressure to deliver to those metrics. But the idea is basically for the team to use those metrics as a way to realize how they need to improve. Hope that answers your question. Okay, I'm happy to discuss it offline if you need to, but yeah, that's in a nutshell. So.
I've got a few more. Yes, over there.
I'm interested to understand how functions like governance, security, delivery assurance have had to adapt to you working in an agile environment.
Okay, probably a good example is to give you a framework. So within the Financial Times, the nature of the content is that it needs to be spot on. It needs to be accurate. The entire industry, our readership depends on the content being accurate. The risk profile as such is very high. If you put something wrong in the press. The same philosophy has disseminated its way into technology. So whatever we release in technology has to be spot on. The big danger now is that we can't, the nature, as I mentioned earlier, is that every technology release at some point will fail. So part of the challenge is when we're dealing with security, governance frameworks, etc., is to actually create a risk profile around the service. It's happened in some cases, it hasn't happened in others, in some cases it's in transition. So the idea is that, for example, if we have, we have a personalization tool on the site. If the tool breaks, it's not going to break the entire website. It's basically a feature that would be nice to have if it's there, but if it breaks, fine. You know, you can still carry on reading the content. It's not a biggie, effectively. So the risk profile on that particular product is slightly low. So this needs to be communicated to the business and said, okay, it's slightly lower than the main ft.com site. So we can afford for it to break, which means that we can actually do other stuff around it. We can actually deliver it on a different platform if we need to. The SLA around it is different, the incident management, the service transition around it, the service delivery, release cycles, change management, etc. is all different because of the nature of the product. Different titles also, again, are seen as 100% priority, and all the risk profiles are high, but it's communicating to the business and saying, okay, look, reality is you can't really have this because you need to prioritize what is high, what is low. Salesforce, a good example. So a lot of our customer data is on Salesforce. Salesforce in the world of cloud is not the best platform if you want to plonk customer data on it because it goes down. It goes down every quarter. It's okay for businesses within the UK because the window when it goes down is kind of, I think it's Sunday morning, ridiculous hour. But if you're a global business, that downtime will impact you. Is communicating these kind of things to the business and saying, okay, the risk profile, although you're expecting 5 nines or 4 nines, reality is the technology we actually bought into is not. So that's kind of communicating it back into security, compliance, framework, standards, etc. And it's having that kind of to and fro conversation until we reach a mutually kind of amicable decision. So I hope that kind of answers your question there. Yep.
Go for it.
Yes, a question on the slide you had where you said you used a mixture of Scrum and Kanban, and you don't just do Agile for Agile's sake, you can be pragmatic. Now, most of last year I worked in a team where the manager had a pile of books on Agile and Scrum and everything that was taller than her monitors, and she was very pro-Agile, but I am as well. But so what this question is about, it's more about the testing side. So she insisted every single class, every single method, every single view model, every single model in a WPF application had to be unit tested. Then there had to be integration tests across the server side and the client side, and then there had to be acceptance tests. We used Fitness. There had to be acceptance tests as well that covered every single scenario, and the acceptance test was basically duplicating code from the integration test, and then the stored procs all had to be unit tested as well, every single one of them with every single scenario, and it ended up dogging us down a little bit, and us developers, we had to fight back against her and say, like, you know, there's certain parts of the system here that don't really need integration tests, don't even need unit tests, because you don't need to unit test a singleton base class, for example. So, how do you handle someone who is, or a team where you've got so much Agile being forced upon you, and it is being pragmatic, or they're trying to be pragmatic, but being almost too pragmatic.
Okay. Without being insulting to that lady, I would say within the FT, we're very lucky because we actually have a lot of intelligent people. So there's pros and cons. When you have a lot of intelligent people in a room, there'll be a lot of chat, a lot of discussion, but not necessarily much delivery. So, but at the same time, because of that intelligence and that, it brings with it a certain amount of common sense. And again, it's assumed common sense is common. So part of that is actually getting people to realize why they're actually making these decisions. So that to that lady, you'd say, okay, what are you ultimately trying to achieve? What's your end goal? Is it because if you release something, something breaks, is that her neck is on the line? Is that why she's covering her back at every point? And if so, why isn't she sharing that responsibility? It's having these kind of conversations. So a good example is when we use Salesforce. A lot of Apex development is actually done on a given platform. It's a given framework. A lot of the typical traditional software development methods that you do with using, for example, Java, etc., is not going to really apply in Salesforce. Or you can beg, borrow, and steal from those, the best of everything, but ultimately, at some point in time, you have to realize you're working within a container, within a framework. And a lot of that is basically done for you. So you don't necessarily need to go through the entire raft of tests, because these tests automatically, a lot of the problems will be captured as you develop. Using methodologies like TDD, BDD, etc., will catch these kind of issues early on. And also, if you just go replicating the same issue again and again, ultimately, what's the point? That would be my question. What's the point? But it's communicating that in a manner that you would understand, as an example, in your example. Every single business unit has a particular language. Every single service within the FT, for example, has a slightly different flavor. Every team has a slightly different culture. Part of the skill of the developer, and that's why, back to one of my points I made earlier, is maturity. Part of a developer's upbringing is to become mature to business, become mature at actually communicating with the audience, and understanding their language, speaking in their dialect, and communicating these ideas. And that goes a long way. So a lot of my time, when I'm actually brought in to basically do a house cleanup exercise, is because of that entire reason. But it's because traditionally, myself being a developer once upon a time, you have OCD, you live in your own little world. It's the nature of development. It's the nature of the mindset that you have. It's very analytical, very probing, and very accurate, very precise. That's the nature of developers. But that same language can't be translated to the business. And as you move into processes are fluffy. So it's basically making that transition to a fluffy world. And it's becoming the person in the middle. And good developers are the ones who can basically understand what the business wants, but also understand software development concepts and marry the two together. Within the FT, we are very lucky to have those kind of developers. But again, it's a challenge, as John's aware, when we do recruitment, because part of the testing process is basically finding these kind of developers, is the ones who are mature enough to make those kind of judgment calls. And the ones who are not, what we do is we spot the potential in them and nurture that. So I hope that answers your questions a bit of a long-winded answer, but there you go.